The marriage scroll was still warm from the wax seal when Signe pressed the torch to its edge. She had not planned it. That was the truth no one would believe afterward. She had held the torch because the officiating elder's hands were trembling, because the ceremony required someone to light the altar braziers, and she had been standing there, the closest body, the least important body, and so the torch had been placed in her hands, the way unpleasant duties were always placed in her hands, without ceremony, without eye contact, without apology. The flame was in her grip. The scroll was on the altar. The hall smelled of pine resin and packed bodies, and the particular cold that seeped through the stone walls of Jarnheim's great mead hall in late autumn. The kind of cold that made your lungs feel raw when you breathed too deeply. She looked at the scroll. She looked at the flame. She thought of the word property, stamped in red ink on a document she had found 2 weeks ago, filed in the Packhouse records room under her name. Not her rank, not her lineage, not even her number, though she had a number. 47, the 47th wolf registered in the Jarnheim rolls. Born during a fever winter, mother deceased at birth, father unknown. Just that word, property of the Jarnheim Alliance, to be transferred upon treaty completion. She thought of it the way you think of a wound when someone presses on it, and her hand moved. The corner of the scroll caught the flame with a sound like an exhale, a small, satisfied breath. And then the fire climbed faster than she had expected. Goatskin parchment. She knew goatskin parchment. She had spent 4 years in Jarnheim's herb stores, preparing animal skins for the healer's records, and she knew exactly how fast they burned. Quickly, completely, without mercy. 300 warriors filled the mead hall. Every one of them had gone still. The marriage scroll, 4 months of border negotiation, grain treaties, bloodline verification, 2 kingdoms' futures compressed into a single sheet, turned to ash in her hands. And across the altar, 6 feet away, the Alpha King of Ashenmoor watched it happen. His name was Aldric Halverson. She had heard it spoken the way you heard storm warnings. Low, controlled, with the particular weight of something that could kill you. She had not been supposed to be here. She was not Brynja Jarnsson, the Alpha Jarl's eldest daughter, the intended bride, the beautiful one with her wheat-pale hair and her careful smile. Brynja was in the infirmary, with a fever that had chosen this morning, to spike hot enough that she could not stand. Signe had been sent to hold her place in the processional. Just the processional. Just to fill the space in the line so the delegation from Ashenmoor would not see an empty gap where the bride should be. No one had put a torch in Brynja's hands. The fire finished its work. Ash drifted between them like dark snow. The Alpha King's eyes, gray as winter storm clouds, darker than she had expected, flecked with something almost black, moved from the burning remnants of the scroll to her face, and did not move again. She met his gaze. She did not know why. Every instinct, every 9 years of careful invisibility, every lesson she had learned in the art of not being noticed, screamed at her to look down, to bow, to make herself small. But her hands had just burned a marriage treaty, and she was already condemned. And there was something in the way he looked at her, not with fury, not with the cold calculation she had expected, something that was almost like recognition. She did not look away. His eyes, she would think later, were the color of ash itself, not gray, ash. The color of something that had been fire, and remembered. The burning did not begin there. It began 5 days earlier, in the stone cellar beneath Jarnheim's healing hall, where Signe spent her nights between the living and the dead. She was Jarnheim's herb keeper's assistant, had been since she was 14, when the old healer Ragnhildur had found her sleeping in the drawing room because it was the warmest place in the complex, and the only place the senior pack members did not patrol. Ragnhildur had not asked questions. She had handed Signe a mortar and pestle and told her that the plants deserved careful preparation, even if the people who received them did not notice the care. For 9 years, Signe had dried valerian and yarrow and woundwort. She had catalogued symptom progressions in her neat, careful script. She had assisted in 3 difficult births, 2 poisonings, and more wound treatments than she could count. She knew the difference between a wound that would close cleanly and one that would fester. She knew how long fever sweat smelled before it turned the corner toward healing. She knew the precise combination of meadowsweet and willow bark that would reduce pain without clouding the mind. And she knew this because she had tested it on herself first. Because who else would trust her enough to let her try? The stone cellar was cold. It was always cold. The oil lamps cast an amber light that made everything look like it was already preserved in honey. And the smell was a constant layering of dried herbs and iron and the beeswax she used to seal the medicine crocks. And underneath it all, so familiar she barely noticed it anymore, the faint copper smell of blood. Signe had calculated, once, that she spent more time in the healing cellars than she spent in any other place in Jornheim. The dead were better company than most of the living. The dying, at their most frightened and most real, were the best company of all. They did not call her nullblood when she was tending their wounds. The word had followed her since her 18th birthday, the traditional assessment year, when the Jornheim pack healer had pressed 2 fingers to the inside of her wrist, listened, and written in her file the words that had defined the 9 years since. Wolf silent. No shift capability detected. Classification: nullblood. A wolf without a wolf. A body that carried the genetic lineage of the pack, but could not access the power of it. Among the Jornheim wolves, this was only slightly less shameful than having no pack lineage at all. Alpha Jarl Ormond had reviewed her file personally. She had watched him do it from across the table in his receiving room, his iron-gray beard moving slightly as he read, his face betraying nothing until the moment he set the file down and said, in a voice that was entirely without cruelty, which somehow made it worse, "You are useful. You will be useful here." She was useful. Not valued, not claimed. Useful, like a good knife. But 5 days before the burning, something changed. She was in the lower records room, organizing the old treaty documents. Another useful task assigned to her because she was careful and did not make errors. When a document slipped from a cracked binding and fell open on the stone floor, she picked it up without thinking. Her eyes caught a phrase before her brain could stop them. The bloodline of the Ashenmoor matriarchal line, last confirmed carrier, Aldric Halverson, née of Jarnheim's Silverwood kin, deceased. The name meant nothing to her for a moment. Then it meant everything. Her mother had been called Astrid. Her mother, who had died during the fever winter the same year Signe was born. Her mother, whose file in the pack records had been sealed with the notation that said only, "Lineage contested, file restricted." Signe held the fallen document in hands that had gone very still. She did not read further. She refolded the document, replaced it in its binding, and returned it to its shelf with the same careful movements she used when handling a patient's wound, steadily, without disturbing more than necessary. Then she went back to her cellar and sat on the edge of her workbench and pressed her palm flat against her own breastbone. And felt it. A vibration. So low it was almost below sensation. Like a note played in a register her ears couldn't quite reach. Like something underneath her ribs that had always been there, always been dormant, and had just heard something. She told no one. 3 days before the burning, the Ashenmoor war host rode through the northern gate of Jarnheim. Signe was not supposed to be anywhere near the welcome. She had her own duties. A crate of medicinal wax had been delivered to the wrong stores room, and Ragnhild had sent her to retrieve it before the cold turned the salves too hard to work with. The wrong stores room was near the stables. The stables backed onto the welcome yard. She heard the silence first. The Jarnheim wolves who lined the gate went quiet in the way that prey animals went quiet when something at the top of the food chain entered their territory. Not the silence of respect. She knew that silence, had heard it during the Jarl's formal processions. This was something older. the silence of creatures whose bodies made decisions faster than their minds. She looked through the stable gate. The Alpha King of Ashenmoor did not enter the welcome yard so much as he occupied it. He was tall enough that she registered his height before she registered his face. Tall and broad, in the way of the old warrior-born bloodlines, the ones that predated the current pack alliances by 300 years. His hair was dark, nearly black, worn loose to his jaw. His face was angular, unhurried, carrying the particular quality of a man who had never once been uncertain about whether he was allowed to be where he was standing. A scar ran from his left brow to the corner of his mouth. Not straight. Nothing about it was surgical or clean. Something had tried to open his face once, and he had healed around it, and apparently found the whole thing too minor to remember. His eyes were gray. From this distance, in this light, they looked almost colorless, like iron in shadow, like the sea before a storm resolved into something. They were scanning the welcome yard with the unhurried, methodical attention of someone cataloging threats. Not paranoia, not fear. Simple, ingrained efficiency. The kind of awareness that became automatic in people who had survived long enough for survival to become habit. They passed over the stable gate. They passed over her. They stopped. She should have moved. Every sane part of her was screaming at her to pick up her wax crate and go back to the cellar and return to the careful, invisible life she had built out of herbs and lamplight and silence. She did not move. His gaze held on her for 3 full seconds. She counted, because that was what she did. She counted things, measured things, turned everything into data she could hold. And then his attention moved on. Clean, complete, like a wave that passes over a shoreline and leaves it changed without marking it. Signe picked up her wax crate. Her hands were entirely steady. She had always had steady hands. She went back to the cellar. She ground meadowsweet until the bowl was full, and then kept grinding until the meadowsweet was dust and her wrists ached, and she did not ask herself why. 2 nights before the burning, a wounded wolf was brought to the healing hall. This was not unusual. The Ashenmoor delegation's secondary warriors had been drilling with the Jornheim Guard, a show of alliance, a performance of peace. And drilling with people you didn't fully trust produced injuries at a predictable rate. Signe had already treated 4 cuts, 2 wrenched shoulders, and 1 cracked rib that the warrior had insisted was only bruised, until she pressed on it, and he stopped insisting. This wolf was different. He had been brought to the lower entrance, not the main hall entrance, which meant someone wanted him treated quietly. He was Ashenmoor, she could tell by the cut of his wool cloak, the particular style of the iron clasp at his shoulder. He was young. He was unconscious, and the wound in his side, when she unwrapped the field dressing, was silver bright at the edges. Silver poisoning. She had read about it. She had never seen it in person, because silver weapons were banned under the current pack agreements, which meant someone in the Jornheim compound was carrying an illegal blade, which meant this wound was a political event dressed as a medical one. She sent the runner who had brought him away with orders to find Ragnhild. Then she began cleaning the wound, because a silver laceration did not wait for politics. She was 3 minutes into the process. Silver-contaminated wounds required different treatment, required drawing the metal out before it could spread. When the door opened, she did not look up. "I told the runner to bring Ragnhildur. If you're not Ragnhildur, wait outside." "I am not Ragnhildur." The voice was low and even, and carried the particular resonance of someone who had never once needed to raise it to be heard. Signe looked up. The Alpha King of Ashenmoor filled her doorway the way he had filled the welcome yard. Not with aggression, not with performance, but with simple, undeniable mass. He had to duck to clear the lintel. He looked at the wounded wolf on her table, then he looked at her. "He is mine," Aldric Halverson said. "His name is Fenric. He has been with me since he was 16. He is also currently losing the fight against a silver laceration," Signe said. "And I need to concentrate, so you can either sit there quietly or leave and come back when I'm finished." A pause. She was not sure, in that pause, whether she was about to be thrown through the wall or not. She found, to her own distant surprise, that she could not adjust her trajectory either way. Her hands were already back on the wound, because Finric needed her hands more than she needed to manage whatever political consequences her tone had just generated. The Alpha King sat down on the low stool beside the door, and was quiet. She worked for 40 minutes. The silver withdrawal required careful, methodical extraction, identifying where the metal had migrated, drawing it out in order of depth, keeping the wound clean between each pass. It was painstaking work. She was aware throughout of the silent weight of him at the edges of the room, not watching her with the particular scrutiny of someone cataloging errors, but watching with the stillness of someone who was simply present, not performing patience, actually patient. When Fenric's breathing stabilized and the wound's edges began showing the normal pink-red of clean tissue rather than the silver-white of contamination, Signe set down her tools and pressed a folded cloth against the wound. "He'll need to stay still for at least 2 days," she said. "The silver didn't reach the major tissue, but he'll run a fever tonight as his body clears the residue. I'll need to check him every 4 hours." "You do this alone?" She looked up at him. He was watching her with that same gray attention, evaluating, curious, but not performing curiosity. "Ragnhildr has the upper patients. I have the lower ones. And I'm better with silver cases. I've studied the treatment more thoroughly." "Because you treat it alone?" "Because I study everything thoroughly," she said. "It's what I do when I don't have anything else to do." He looked at her for a moment. Then, "Who put the silver blade in this hall?" "I don't know," she said. It was the truth. "But I can tell you the angle of entry and the approximate height of the person who used it, if that helps." The corner of his mouth, the unscarred side, moved. Not a smile, not quite, but something. "Tell me," he said. She told him. She watched him file the information away with the same clean efficiency she used when organizing the medicinal records, and she thought, oddly, that they probably categorized things the same way, not because it was demanded of them, but because it was the only way that made sense. He left just before the midnight bell. At the door, he stopped without turning around. "Your name," he said. Not "what is your name?" Just the words, an extension of attention. "Signe," she said. He walked through the door. She stood in her lamplight for a moment, her hands still slightly damp from the wound treatment, and listened to his footsteps fade up the corridor, and felt, underneath her ribs, that low hum again, louder now, steady as a second heartbeat. She pressed her palm against her sternum. She did not sleep well that night. One day before the burning, Ragnhildr sent Signe to the eastern herb garden to harvest the last of the autumn yarrow before the first hard frost killed it. The garden was small, enclosed by a low stone wall, situated at the back of the complex, where the pack house structures gave way to the tree line. It was the only place in Jornheim where Signe had ever felt, however tentatively, like the space belonged to her as much as to anyone else. She had planted half of what grew there. She had tended it through 3 growing seasons. She was on her knees in the frost-softened earth, her fingers moving through the yarrow with the automatic ease of long familiarity, when she heard footsteps on the stone path. She knew, without turning, who it was. Not from the sound alone, though the weight and cadence of those steps had already, in 24 hours, become distinct to her the way a particular patient's gait became recognizable before their face did. She knew because the hum beneath her ribs shifted register, moving from its steady background frequency into something more present, more directed, like a compass needle orienting. "You're up early," she said to the yarrow. "I don't sleep much." He stopped on the path a few feet away. She could feel his attention on the back of her neck the way you felt sunlight, directionless and sourceless until it reached you, and then, very specifically there. "Neither do I," she said. She kept harvesting. Her hands were steady. A silence. Not uncomfortable, the particular kind of silence that exists when two people are both accustomed to their own company and are discovering, with some surprise, that another person's company does not require filling. "You built this," he said, and she could tell from the slight adjustment in his voice that he was looking at the garden, the trellised woundwort, the organized beds, the way she had structured the plantings to catch morning light. "I maintain it. I planted about half. Ragnhildur planted the rest before she got too old for kneeling work." "You organized it differently than she would have." "How do you know how she would have organized it?" "There's a logic to how it's arranged now that doesn't fit an old-style healer's priorities. The woundwort is closest to the entrance. A traditional healer would put that near the center. You put it at the front because you use it most, and you want to access it quickly." Signe sat back on her heels and looked up at him. He was watching the garden, with the same cataloging attention he turned on everything. But there was something different in it now, something almost like appreciation. "You notice things," she said. "It's useful." "It must get exhausting," she said, and only realized as the words left her mouth that she had not weighed them before speaking them, had simply said the true thing, without protection. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "It does." She turned back to the yarrow. Her heart was doing something irregular that she was choosing not to examine. He crouched down beside her, not close enough to crowd her, close enough that she could smell wood smoke and cold iron and something underneath, something deeper, warmer, like earth after rain. "What is this one?" He indicated a plant to her left. "Yarrow. It stops bleeding. It's one of the most useful things in the garden. Most people overlook it because it looks common." He looked at the plant. Most people overlook the most useful things. It was not, she thought, a commentary on the plant. She looked at his profile. In the pale morning light, the scar along his jaw was more visible. She could see now that it was layered, old and new, the original wound, and then a secondary healing scar over it. Something that had been reopened. A wound that had not been allowed to close all at once. She thought of the word contested in her mother's file. She thought of the hum. "I need to tell you something," she said, before she could decide not to. "About Finric, and about something I found in the records room." He turned and looked at her. The gray of his eyes, this close, was not uniform. There were darker striations in it, like stone that had been through fire, and showed the history of its weathering. "Tell me," he said. She told him about her mother's name in the old treaty document. She told him about the restricted file, the notation about Ashenmore matriarchal bloodline. She told him, carefully, clinically, as if presenting a wound for assessment. "This is what I found. This is what it might mean. This is the information I have and cannot verify." He listened the way he did everything, without interruption, without the performance of reaction. When she finished, the silence held for a moment. "The Silverwood kin," he said slowly. "I know that name. It's in our founding records, a lineage that split from the Ashenmore bloodline 200 years ago. They settled west." "I didn't know there were surviving members of that line." "Neither did I," she said. "Apparently neither did the Jornheim records, since they sealed the file." His jaw tightened. She watched it happen. Not anger, exactly, but the specific quality of controlled response that a person learned when they had spent a long time making sure their reactions were never weapons someone else could use against them. "I'll look into it," he said. "The Ashenmore archives have the full matriarchal records. If your mother's name is in them, it doesn't change anything," Signe said quickly. "About the treaty, about the mating contract." "It changes everything," he said, and the quietness of it made it more final than a shout. She looked at him. He was looking at her with an expression she didn't have a name for. The gray of his eyes had shifted, something unlocking in them that she suspected very few people had ever seen. She thought, "I am kneeling in dirt beside an Alpha King who is telling me that my bloodline changes everything." And she did not know what to do with that sentence, so she set it aside and kept her hands in the yarrow. His hand, at some point, had come to rest on the low stone wall beside her, close enough that if she reached left, she would touch his knuckles. She kept her hands in the yarrow, but she was aware, acutely, specifically, with every nerve ending she had, of the 3 inches between his hand and hers. And so they arrived at the altar. She had been placed there because Brynja was ill and someone needed to fill the processional line. She had been given the torch because she was closest and least significant. She had stood before the scroll with the flame and 300 witnesses and thought about the word property. And then her hand had moved. Now the ash settled between them on the altar stone. The hall was so quiet she could hear the torches guttering in the wall sconces, the small papery sound of fire consuming the last shred of the treaty. Pack Alpha. Ormund Jarnsson was on his feet. He was a broad man, barrel-chested, with a gray-red beard and eyes that went cold before the rest of his face caught up with them. He was looking at Signe the way a man looked at something that had just cost him significantly. "Seize her," he said. No one moved. Not because the guards lacked the willingness, because the Alpha King of Ashenmoor had stepped forward. One step, positioning himself between Signe and the nearest guard. And the guards were doing the calculation that guards did when presented with a target and an obstacle. How badly do I want this task? And is this obstacle something I can explain to my descendants? Aldric Halverson did not draw his weapon. He did not raise his voice. He simply stood there, and the weight of him in the space was sufficient. "She will not be seized," he said. The hall breathed. Ormund's face went through several expressions rapidly. "My lord, she destroyed the treaty." "She destroyed a document," Aldric said. "The treaty was not the document. The treaty was the negotiation, and I am here to renegotiate." "You rode 3 weeks." "Then let us not waste the journey on drama." His voice was even, unhurried. He looked at Ormund over the ash-dusted altar. "Your daughter is ill." "The girl before me." He did not look at Signe, not directly, but she felt his awareness of her the way she felt the hum, underneath the surface, steady. "Has just made her position on the original terms very clear. I am proposing new terms. Sit down, Jarnsson." Ormund sat. Not because he wanted to, because the room had already decided, in the collective animal instinct of 300 wolves, that the Alpha King had spoken. In the following silence, Signe became aware that she was still holding the torch, that her knuckles were white around the handle, that the flame was burning down toward her hand. Aldric turned to her. He was close. Closer than the garden, closer than the healing room. The altar steps had compressed the distance between them to something that registered as entirely different information. She could see the details of his face clearly, the layered scar, the gray-dark eyes, the particular still quality of someone who had learned, a long time ago, that stillness was its own kind of power. He took the torch from her hand, not roughly, not gently. Just with certainty, his fingers closing over hers for a moment before he moved it aside and set it in the nearest wall bracket. Her hand remembered the warmth of his for a long time after he let go. "Are you afraid?" he asked, quietly, for her ears only. She considered the question with the same honesty she brought to medical assessments. "No," she said. "Should I be?" He looked at her for a moment, and then, for the second time, in the unscarred corner of his mouth, that almost thing that was almost a smile and wasn't. "No," he said. Ormund recovered himself within an hour. Whatever the Alpha King's intervention in the hall had bought Signe, it bought her 1 hour of informal safety, while the Ashenmoor delegation retreated to the council chamber to renegotiate terms. She spent that hour in the lower corridor outside the healing hall, sitting on the cold stone floor with her back against the wall, listening to the silence of the compound and cataloging what she knew, which was, the treaty was ash. Her mother had been Ashenmoor bloodline. Ormund was going to want someone punished for the first thing. The Alpha King had put himself between her and the guards. She pressed her palm flat against her sternum and felt the hum, steadier than ever, and thought, "This is inconvenient." The sound of boots on stone, quick and purposeful, resolved into Brynja Jarnsson's personal attendant, a small, sharp-faced woman named Isolde, who had always treated Signe with the particular mixture of dismissal and wary respect that people reserve for someone they considered beneath them but didn't fully understand. "The Jarl wants you," Isolde said. "I assumed," Signe said. The council chamber was warm, too warm. The fire had been built high, and the warmth had the pressed, anxious quality of a room where people had been arguing. Ormund sat at the head of the long table. His son Bjarne, 2 years younger than Signe and 3 times as loud, sat to his right with the expression of someone who had been waiting for an excuse to be righteous. 3 of the senior pack advisors flanked them. The Ashenmore delegation was gone. That was the first thing she noticed. The second thing she noticed was that Ormund was holding a document she did not recognize, and the hand holding it was very steady, which in her experience was worse than an unsteady hand. "You are aware," Ormund said, "of the consequences of destroying a formal alliance treaty." "I burned a scroll," Signe said. "I'm told there's a difference." Bjarne made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "You will be remanded to the Eastern Holding," Ormund said. "You will remain there until the new terms have been settled, at which point you will be assigned your role in whatever arrangement the Alpha King proposes. You are not, at present, being charged with treaty destruction." He paused, and in the pause she heard the word "yet" very clearly, though he did not say it. "Because the Alpha King has requested, specifically and by name, that you not be restrained." She had expected banishment. She had been prepared for banishment. She had not been prepared for that sentence. She kept her face still. "I see." "You will conduct yourself with appropriate—" "Yes," she said. "Is that everything?" Ormund looked at her for a long moment. He had never, she realized, looked at her for this long before. She had always been peripheral. Peripheral things did not require sustained attention. "What are you?" he said, and for the first time his voice had something in it that was not authority. Something older. Something that sounded almost like the beginning of fear. Signe thought of her mother's name in the sealed file. She thought of the hum. She thought of the gray, dark eyes watching her across an altar of ash. "I'm Jornheim's herb-keeper's assistant," she said. "You told me so yourself." She left. The Eastern Holding was not a prison. It was a detached cottage at the edge of the compound, used for quarantine patients and diplomatic visitors who required separate accommodation. It had a hearth, a narrow bed, a window that looked east toward the forest tree line, and a door that was not locked. Signe checked the door first. Not locked was different from not watched, but it was a start. She was there for 3 days. The first day she received 2 visitors. Ragnhildur, who brought her medicine supplies and said nothing except, "I taught you to be useful, not to be invisible, so this is probably inevitable." And Isolde, who brought clean linens and said everything she was thinking in the compressed silence between each armload. The second day she received 1 visitor. The knock was quiet. 3 short, even raps, not demanding, not hesitant, just informational. She opened the door. Aldric Halverson stood in the gray afternoon light with his cloak damp at the shoulders from the misting rain that had been falling since morning. He was holding in one large hand a covered clay bowl. She stared at him. She could not, for a moment, reconcile the image with any framework she had. "Fenric wanted to thank you," he said. "He sent food. He is 17 and has limited vocabulary for gratitude, so he defaulted to feeding people." "He sent it," she said. "He sent it," Aldric agreed, with the absolute neutrality of a man who was not admitting anything. She stepped back from the door. He brought the bowl in, set it on the table by the window, and remained standing in the way he did everything, taking up exactly the space he required and no more. The cottage, which had felt adequate when it was empty, felt different with him in it. Not small, just full, in a specific warm way, like a room after a fire has been lit. "Sit down," she said, "if you want." He looked at the chair for a moment, then he sat. She uncovered the bowl. It was a thick broth with root vegetables and salt meat, still warm, with bread wrapped in a cloth beside it. Fenrick's gratitude was, she noted, extremely well provisioned. She brought 2 cups to the table without thinking about it, and only realized what she'd done when she looked up and found Aldric watching her hands. She poured from the small pitcher Ragnhildr had left. He accepted the cup without comment. They sat with the window between them and the gray forest beyond, and drank, and were quiet together in the particular way they had been quiet in the garden. Not the silence of people with nothing to say, but the silence of people who had, over a very short and very strange span of time, developed a vocabulary that did not require sound. "The new terms," she said eventually, "are being negotiated." "Am I part of them?" He looked at the window. His profile, in the gray light, was all angles: jaw, brow, the architectural fact of the scar. "That depends on what you want." "I want—" She stopped. No one had ever asked her that question. She was aware that no one had asked her that question in 23 years, and the absence of it had become so complete, but the presence of the question now felt structurally destabilizing. Like a wall she had been leaning against had turned out to be a door. "I want to know about my mother's bloodline," she said finally. "And I want to not be transferred like a document." She paused. "Both of those things. In that order." He turned from the window and looked at her directly. The gray of his eyes had shifted again. That unlocking thing she had noticed in the garden, more open now, like a wound that was finally being given air. "The Ashenmore archives have everything," he said. "I have already sent for the relevant records. They will be here by the end of the week." He paused. "As for the other matter, no one transfers you. That was never going to be the arrangement. Not from my side." She looked at him. "Then why come? Why negotiate a mating contract at all, if not for—" "Because there was a war coming," he said. "And I needed it not to come. The contract was the instrument. The person on it—" He stopped. Something moved across his face that she suspected he had not intended. "Was not the arrangement I would have chosen." The silence after that sentence was different. It had weight and temperature. It sat between them on the table like something neither of them had put there deliberately, but both of them could see. Signe looked at her cup. "You kneeled in the dirt for me," she said quietly. "In the garden. When you were looking at the plant I pointed out. You just went to your knees. An Alpha King in the mud." It was easier to see it from that angle. "That's not why." He was quiet for a moment, then, "No, it's not." The rain ticked against the window. Her cup was warm between her palms. She thought about the 3 inches between his hand and hers in the garden, and she thought about the warmth of his fingers on hers when he took the torch. And she thought that the hum beneath her ribs had never been quieter or more present than it was right now. She did not say any of this, but she thought he might know anyway, from the way he did not leave, from the way he sat in the chair beside the window and watched the gray rain with her until the light failed. The records arrived in 4 days, not 7. Aldric brought them himself. She found them on the table when she returned from the morning herb harvest. She had been given limited movement in the grounds, carefully monitored, which she found less insulting than she might have previously, because Ragnhildr had told her flatly that it was the Alpha King who had negotiated even that much freedom. The records were 3 scrolls, sealed with the Ashenmore mark, a crescent moon pierced by 3 vertical lines. She knew that symbol. She had seen it on Aldric's guard's armor, on Fenrick's cloak clasp, and she had seen it, the first time, in the sealed file she was not supposed to have read. She had the scrolls open within minutes. The Ashenmore matriarchal records were meticulous in the way that only very old, very careful archivist produced. Every name, every birth date, every migration noted in handwriting that changed across centuries as different keepers took over the task. She moved through generations the way she moved through the herb garden, with patience, with purpose, knowing what she was looking for, and trusting the knowledge to reveal itself. She found her mother's name on the 7th page. Astrid of the Silverwood line, daughter of Ingrid, born year of the long winter. Carried to Jarnheim territory in the year of the border settlement. Status: bloodline intact, wolf gift dormant. Generational suppression. See notes, page 14. Her hands stopped. Generational suppression. She turned to page 14. The notes were written in a different hand, older, more formal. The Silverwood branch of the Ashenmore matriarchal bloodline carries a documented pattern of gift dormancy. In times of prolonged stress or cultural displacement, the wolf gift may enter a deep suppression state, present in the bloodline, non-manifest in the individual. This is not extinction. This is waiting. The gift, when triggered, typically by proximity to a mate bond resonance, re-emerges fully and suddenly. She read it 3 times. Then she looked up from the scroll and pressed both hands flat on the table, breathing carefully. Nullblood. The stamp in her file. The 9 years of being classified as a body without purpose. The silence her wolf had always held. The absence she had been taught to understand as a permanent lack, rather than a waiting. The hum underneath her ribs chose this moment to do something it had never done before. It did not hum. It rang. One clear note, deep and specific, like a bell struck for the first time in a locked room. She was sitting on the cottage floor when Aldric found her. She did not remember sitting down. She was holding the scroll and the note page, and her back was against the bed frame. And the hum was not a hum anymore. It was a full resonance that she could feel in her teeth. He was through the door without knocking. She heard him before she saw him, that specific tread, those 3 extra inches of height. And then he was crouching in front of her, one hand on the floor beside her hip, not touching her, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of his arm. Signe. His voice was very even. "I'm fine," she said. "You are sitting on the floor." "I sit on floors. I work on floors. This is not alarming." He looked at her with that gray-dark steadiness that saw through everything she said to the things she meant. "What did you find?" She handed him the pages. She watched him read. She watched his jaw tighten. Not with anger, with something held in, something that had the shape of a long-borne weight being recognized. "They knew," she said. "The Jarnheim records. Ormond knew my bloodline was Ashenmore. That's why the file was sealed. He was protecting the asset." "Yes. All of this. All 23 years of nullblood in property." "Yes." His voice was quiet. She could hear what was underneath it. She closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, he was still there, still crouching, still watching her with that expression she had been slowly learning to read. The one where his face gave very little away, but his eyes gave everything. "The dormancy breaks through proximity to a mate bond resonance," she said. "Yes," he said, very carefully. She felt the hum ring again. His eyes, and she watched this happen. She was looking directly at him. She saw it. Shifted. The gray fractured. Underneath it, like fire seen through frosted glass, something gold. His wolf. Not fully present, but there. Stirring. She thought, oh. She thought, this is what the hum is. She thought, I've been sitting in the dark long enough that I almost didn't recognize the light. She did not say any of this. She said, the treatment for silver poisoning. You watched me work for 40 minutes, and then you answered my questions about the blade angle without asking me how I knew. You just accepted the information. You didn't ask me to prove I'd earned the right to have it. No, he said. That's... She stopped, searched for words. That was the first time anyone had done that. He held her gaze. The gold was still there, underneath, banked. "I know what it is," he said. "To have people dismiss what you see because they don't trust you're right to be looking." The cottage was warm and gray and full of him, and she was sitting on the floor with her back against the bed frame, and his hand was still on the floor beside her, and she could feel, by now, the warmth of his skin from 3 inches away. "Tell me about the mate bond," she said. "I grew up without full pack knowledge. I only know the textbook version." He was quiet for a moment. Then, with the particular precision of someone who had thought about this and not expected to say it aloud, "It is not a contract. It does not require witnesses or seals. It is not arranged." Another pause. "It recognizes." The hum rang through her, root to crown. She looked at his hand on the floor beside her. She looked at her own hand. She moved it left. Their fingers touched, just the edges. Her smallest finger against his, a point of contact so small it could have been accidental. It was not accidental. She felt the contact as a complete circuit, heat and resonance, and the particular feeling of something that had been aimed in a direction for a very long time, finally arriving. His breath changed. She heard it. She did not look up. "Signe?" he said, very quietly. "Hmm?" she said. "I need to know what you want. Not what you're willing to accept. Not what's survivable. What you want." She turned her hand over. His fingers closed around hers, slowly, with the same careful deliberateness he used for everything. Not rushing, not demonstrating, just present. She looked up at him. His eyes were half gold now, winter storm gray and ember gold in equal measure, and she thought that no one who had ever called her nullblood had the right to stand in the same room as this moment. "I want to see the Ashenmore archives," she said. "All of them. I want to read everything about my mother's bloodline. I want—" She stopped, steadied. "I want to stop surviving and start doing the other thing." "Living," he said. "That one." The corner of his mouth moved, and this time it was not almost a smile. It was a smile. Small, controlled, but genuine. And it changed his face the way dawn changed a winter sky. The cold still present, but the darkness lifted. She felt the warm pressure of his hand around hers. She felt the hum settle into a rhythm that matched her heartbeat. The new treaty negotiation broke down on the 5th day. It broke down because Bjarne Jarnsson, Ormond's son, that loud, righteous boy, walked into the council chamber and placed, on the table before the Ashenmore delegation, a document. An old document, recopied recently enough that the ink was still dark. It detailed the arrangement Ormond had made 20 years ago with the previous Ashenmore king, Aldric's father. The arrangement to keep the Silverwood bloodline in Jarnheim, hidden, available, useful. The room went very quiet. Signe was not supposed to be in the council chamber. She was in the corridor outside, delivering Ragnhilder's morning report to the delegation's healer, which was the legitimate reason anyone could have given for her presence. The door was not fully closed. She heard everything. She heard Ormond's voice, measured, explaining that the arrangement had been made in good faith, that the bloodline had been protected, that Jarnheim had ensured her safety. She heard Aldric's voice, with the qualities she recognized from the night she had told him to sit down or leave, perfectly level, perfectly still, and containing something that rooms felt before he spoke again. He said, "She was not protected. She was warehoused." Ormond said, She spent 9 years underground cataloging herbs because the pack above her classified her as worthless. She was given the worst quarters, the worst duties, the worst of everything a pack can offer its own blood. And you knew what she was. You knew from the start. And you said nothing, and you did nothing, and you stamped her file property and waited. The silence after that was not the silence of people with nothing to say. It was the silence of people who had been named correctly. "The treaty terms," Ormond said at last, "are There are no treaty terms, Aldrich said. There is a reckoning, and when it is done, I will decide what comes after. Signe pressed her back against the corridor wall. Her hands were steady. She noted this with some distant part of herself, the clinical part. The part that had spent 9 years recording cause of death without flinching. The door opened. One of the Ashenmore guards stepped out, saw her, and looked carefully at the middle distance in a way that made it clear he was choosing not to have seen her. Aldrich came through the door behind him. He stopped when he saw her. Something moved through his expression, not surprise, not reproach. Something that looked, she thought, like relief. "You heard," he said. "Yes." "All of it?" "Most of it." He looked at her for a moment. His hands, at his sides, were very still. How are you? "I've known for 9 years that Ormond saw me as an object," she said. "This is not new information. It is only new information with sources cited." He looked at her with the gray-dark gaze that saw through everything. "That is not an answer to the question I asked." She held his gaze. "I'm angry," she said carefully. "I am quite significantly angry. And I would like to—" She stopped, breathed. "I would like to be somewhere that is not this corridor." He stepped to the side. "The garden," he said. "The eastern one." They walked to the garden without speaking. The morning was cold, the frost still on the low-growing plants, the sky the particular flat white of early winter overcast. The wisteria on the archway was long past blooming, bare, twisting branches now, empty of leaves, but still present, still structured, still holding the shape of what it would become again. Signe stopped in the middle of the path and stood very still and let the anger come up through her properly. Not the compressed, habituated anger of 9 years of nullblood, of property stamps and dining halls with unwritten seating charts. The new anger. The acute kind. The kind you only got when you had stopped believing the injury was your fault. Aldrich stood nearby and did not try to manage it. He stood with her the way he had sat with her in the rain-gray cottage, present and non-intrusive, a fact of the space rather than a demand on it. After a while, she said, "My wolf." The dormancy breaks through mate bond resonance, and you said the bond recognizes, not arranges, recognizes. Yes. So, she turned to look at him. The gold was in his eyes again, ambient, steady. You felt it too, from the beginning. He looked at her for a long moment. The silence had the quality of something being decided, something that had actually been decided some time ago and was only now being acknowledged. "From the courtyard," he said, "when I saw you through the stable gate." She absorbed this. She thought about the 3 seconds of his gaze holding on her, the wave over the shoreline. "You said nothing." "You were not mine to say anything too." He said it with the same evenness he said everything, but underneath it, she could hear the shape of restraint. Something that had been held in careful check, for reasons that were good ones, for longer than was comfortable. "I am still not," she began. "I know," he said. "That is the conversation I am asking to have with you. Not to arrange, not to negotiate. To ask." She looked at him. The anger was still there, but it had shifted, moving around this moment rather than through it, finding its proper target, which was Ormond, and the sealed files and the 9 years, and not this. Not the gray-gold eyes and the hand that had closed around hers without demanding anything. "I felt it from the beginning too," she said. "I didn't know what it was. I thought I was developing a fever." She paused. "Which, medically, is not entirely inaccurate." The corner of his mouth moved, and then he laughed, short and quiet and genuine, the sound of something unlocking. She felt the hum ring through her to her very edges. "Ask me then," she said. He looked at her steadily. "Will you come to Ashenmore? Will you read the archives and find what you're looking for?" Will you let me? He stopped, chose words with the care of someone who had spent a long time being precise and knew what imprecision cost. Will you give me the opportunity to show you what this is? Not as a treaty, not as an arrangement. As a question with a real answer, which you can give at whatever speed it takes you to be sure. She looked at his face. She thought of Ragnhildr, who had handed her a mortar and pestle without asking questions. She thought of Fenric and his broth of gratitude. She thought of kneeling in the garden with frost on her knuckles and a man she hadn't expected beside her, looking at the plants she had tended for 3 growing seasons and seeing in them the logic of her mind. She thought of her mother's name in a sealed file, and the word waiting, and the hum that had just become a bell-clear note. Yes, she said. The events that followed moved quickly. Ormond was not removed. He was, in the particular language of pack law, censured, a formal accounting before the Alliance Council that would take months to complete and would not be comfortable. Bjarne, whose revelation of the documents was, to everyone's surprise, an act of conscience rather than politics. He had found the files while settling his father's estate paperwork, and the sight of the word property stamped on a packmate's file had undone something in him that had been building for a long time. Stood witness. Ragnhildr, when Signe came to her to say goodbye, set down the bundle of drying herbs in her hands and opened her arms. They stood in the drawing room that smelled of lavender and old wood and the particular cold of stone walls, and Ragnhildr held on for a long time and said into Signe's hair, "I always thought you were waiting for something. I was afraid the something would never come." "Me too," Signe said. "I want letters." "You'll get them. Long ones, with medical observations. I know what you're like." Signe laughed, and the laugh was wet at the edges, and she held on for another minute before stepping back. The claiming ceremony, or rather, the conversation that preceded and became the claiming, happened in the garden. Aldric's choice, not hers, though when she asked him later, he said only that it seemed like the right place. And she thought about the garden as she had experienced it, the one place that had ever felt, however tentatively, like it was as much hers as anyone's. He brought no witnesses except Fenric, who stood at the garden gate, looking solemn and slightly pale in the way of 17-year-olds, who were attending something significant and were determined not to mess it up. The frost had retreated with the afternoon sun. The bare wisteria branches on the archway were silver-gray and precise against the white sky. "I want to tell you something," Aldric said. They were standing under the arch, facing each other, and he was not performing ceremony. He was just looking at her, with the full weight of all that gray-gold attention, the way he looked at everything he thought mattered. "Tell me," she said. "My wolf has not spoken since my mother died. 6 years. The healers said grief. The pack said dormancy. I said..." He stopped. "I stopped asking." He looked at her steadily. "He speaks now. He has been speaking since the courtyard." She felt her throat tighten with something that was not sadness. "What does he say?" she asked. Aldric looked at her with the expression she had been learning to read, the one where his face gave very little and his eyes gave everything. He says, "Finally." The hum in her chest rang out like a chorus. Her wolf, dormant for 23 years, wading through sealed files and nullblood stamps and dining halls with unwritten seating charts, woke up. It was not violent. It was not dramatic. It was like a window opening in a room that had been shut too long. A rush of air and light, and the realization, sudden and vast, of how much you had been missing without knowing you were missing it. She felt the power of it move through her in a wave, warm and clean, and her eyes, she knew this, could feel it the way she felt the warmth in his hands, changed. Fenric made a sound at the garden gate that he would later describe as a cough, and that was clearly nothing of the sort. Aldric looked at her changed eyes. The gold in his own was fully present now. His wolf, his grief-silent wolf, present and certain and there. Finally, she said. He reached up and touched her face, his thumb against her cheekbone, careful, the calluses of a warrior's hands, warm and rough and unhurried. His eyes were all gold, and she thought that if anyone had told her, 9 years ago in the cold drying room, with her mortar and pestle, that this was what was waiting at the end of the long tunnel of surviving, she might not have believed them. She was glad she hadn't needed to believe. She had only needed to last. "This is not a contract," he said. "There's nothing to sign." "Good," she said. "I'm done with scrolls." The corner of his mouth lifted, that real smile, the dawn-through-winter one, and he tilted her head gently to expose the curve of her neck, the place where the mark would go. "This will hurt," he said. "I know what pain is," she said. "This kind I choose." He kissed the place first, just a press of lips against skin, warm, deliberate, unhurried. She felt it from the base of her skull to the soles of her feet. Her hands found his chest without instruction. The hum became a single, sustained note. And then his teeth, partial shift, precise, the bite brief and deep and searing. And the pain expanded outward, like a stone dropped in still water, and she gasped. And then the pain changed, turned, became something else, something warm and enormous and connected. She felt him, not his body, his everything. 6 years of grief for a dead mother. The particular loneliness of power without witness. The long silence of a wolf that had stopped speaking, and the precise quality of what it felt like when it started again. She felt these things the way you felt the contents of a room when someone opened the door. All at once, dimensional, real. Her eyes were wet. She didn't try to manage it. He pulled back. His eyes were gold and present, and he looked at her with an expression that had nothing held back in it, and she thought she would spend a long time learning all the things that face could do when it wasn't being careful. "Sign of the Silverwood line," he said. "Moonwoken." "My mate." "Aldric Halverson," she said. "Man who knelt in the dirt for me. My mate." At the gate, Fenric produced a sound that he continued to maintain was absolutely a cough. 3 weeks later, Signe returned to the Jornheim herb cellar one final time. Not to work, to collect what was hers. There was not much. A bundle of her reference scrolls, worn soft at the edges from handling. A wool shawl Ragnhildr had given her 2 winters ago, the color of dried lavender and slightly misshapen from being folded wrong too many times. A small iron pendant she had found years ago in the drying room floor and had kept without knowing why. A crescent moon, pierced by 3 vertical lines. A piece of someone's clasp or badge, carried there on a coat or a saddlebag, fallen and forgotten. She stood in the cellar with the oil lamps turned low, and the smell of herbs and the steady cold of stone, and looked at the space where she had spent 9 years surviving. The workbenches were clean. The crocks were organized. Everything was exactly as she had left it, because she had always left things exactly as she would have wanted to find them. She set the pendant down on the central workbench. The crescent moon in 3 lines caught the lamplight, spinning slightly where she'd rested it. A footstep in the corridor. Not Ragnhildr. Heavier, longer stride. He filled the doorway the way he filled every doorway, with the simple, undeniable fact of himself. He looked at the cellar, at the workbenches, at the organized rows of medicinal crocks, at the pendant catching lamplight. "This is where you lived," he said. "This is where I survived," she said. "There is a difference." He nodded. He had told her something similar in the garden, about absence and dormancy. Not the same as death, but not the same as life either. He understood the taxonomy of endurance. "Are you ready?" he asked. She looked at the pendant one more time. Her mother had carried this bloodline here, in silence, in waiting. She had carried it for 23 years without knowing it was a carrying. The crescent moon turned on the workbench, slow and certain. She was ready. She walked to the door. Aldric's hand found the small of her back. warm through the wool of her traveling cloak, the pressure of it steady and unpossessive and entirely specific to her. They climbed the stairs out of the cellar. The late afternoon light was waiting for them at the top, broad and pale, and carrying the smell of first frost and distant pine forests, and, from somewhere behind the compound walls, the last of the eastern garden's hardy herbs still holding against the season. Signe squinted against it. She had spent 9 years underground. The light was going to take some getting used to. Behind her, the oil lamps in the cellar burned on for a while after she left them. Amber light, warm and steady. And the crocks sat organized on their shelves, and the shawl was gone from its hook, and the pendant turned once more on the workbench before it stilled. And in the sealed files in the records room above, the word property waited in its red ink. But the file was no longer the whole story. The whole story was climbing into morning light, with warm hands at her back and gold in her eyes. And ahead of her, Ashenmore and archives, and a wolf that had finally stopped waiting. The hum was always there. It was not the beginning of something. It was the recognition of something that had begun long before either of them were looking.